After being woken up so abruptly, I struggled to get the sleep out of my eyes and got to my feet, and I could hear the happiness in my brother's voice as he kept talking. I finally got all the wits about me as I walked right past the mirror's opening and went around it so that we headed to the back of the cave. It didn't take long before I began to notice something. The air was getting colder with every step, and I could also feel a draft, even through all my gear. Looking around, I could see the elves wrapped up in blankets. I recognized them as the blankets from my house, even though one had actually come from the back of my car. I would have been angry, but I figured those kids huddling together under it needed a whole lot more than I did. It didn't take long to reach the back of the cave where the wall stood. I looked at my brother and said, "Okay, now what?" He grinned at me and asked me, "If this was a cave, then why is there a wall here?" At that point, I could have butt-stroked myself in the face for not realizing this sooner. Looking close, I could see where he had chipped away some of the mortar. This was where the source of the air had suddenly come from. He must have mentioned this to our other brother because he suddenly came running up with a sledgehammer, a pickaxe, and a couple of shovels. I slung my rifle across my back and picked up the sledgehammer and said, "All right, let's get to work." Now, it wasn't the easiest wall to take down, but not being one of modern cement allowed us to make rather large hole pretty quickly. The bricks were at least 8 inches wide and 12 inches long, and another 12 inches deep. There was no rebar or any reinforcement to it, so we punched through it and we could collapse large sections once we did. Looking through with my headlamp, I could see that the tunnel went for another 100 feet at least and then seemed to just stop. This would have made one wonder why they built the wall until you listened and could hear water running. The burst of air that came rushing in made even my new elven friends huddle even closer to the fire. They really didn't seem to like the cold at all. Though, to be fair, if I was wearing nothing but a blanket, I would have been cold too. My little brother went to go get more wood for the fire as we continued to clear the wall. We were almost done when the radio squawked at us. It was my friend calling. "Hey, you guys can lose the mask. With all the new air in this place, it's clear of methane." Even though my older brother took his mask off and took a deep breath, I was a little busy to take mine off at the time. That's actually when we heard the screaming. A scream of absolute horror echoed down the cave. My brother and I turned and ran back, dropping the tools as we ran around, and I pulled the rifle around off my back. It was only about 30 seconds before we could see the fire and the elves were near it, but backing away from something. We didn't figure what until we ran right through the mirror to the other side. That was when the screaming began again. My brother-in-law froze, looking around to see what it could be. I had my rifle up scanning the room, and the elves kept making a bunch of noise, but we didn't see anything. I asked, "What the hell are they screaming about?" And my friend had no idea. He said he took off his respirator, and they all started screaming in some strange language. I turned, and sure enough, they were backing away from my big brother because he had his mask off too. I couldn't believe I didn't realize it sooner. We had been in full cover since we first arrived. With the strange look of our masks, or at least strange to them, they probably thought we were demons or something. We began motioning to them to calm down, which had little to almost no effect. Finally, I yelled just to get their attention. Really wish I knew their language at that point. I put my hand up and motioned to my brother to get back. I knelt down next to the fire and reached out my hands for them to take. They were clearly scared of us, though I had to figure out why. Best guess was that the humans of this world were far more violent than we thought. Eventually, a young one, I'm guessing about 8, walked up and took my hand. Then, on the other side, another young one, I'd say about 14 maybe, took my other hand. I brought their hands up to the sides of my head and guided their fingers to the release of my mask, then motioned for them to raise it. They pulled it off slowly and with a few gasps heard, but no one screaming and yelling. After taking the mask and placing it back into its pouch, I just stayed there until they all calmed down a bit more. That is when I heard a voice I didn't recognize. I figured you would find your way down here. I jumped to my feet and looked around, my eyes adjusted enough that I could see a man standing in the doorway. He looked about 10, 15 years older than me, dressed in a mix of medieval and ancient Eastern clothing, holding just a torch. I grabbed my rifle and began to walk up to him. As I got closer, I could see a fairly well-trimmed beard on his lean face and those deep brown eyes. As I walked, I could feel myself putting my finger on the trigger, not knowing if this was an ambush or not. As I stopped about 10 feet from him, he said, "I was expecting your older brother." I responded, "He's here too." The man seemed to grin at this. We stood facing each other for a minute before he spoke again. You do remember me, don't you?" "It's okay. I mean, you were just a little kid back then." He took a few steps so that his face was right next to the bars. "The last time I saw you, you were barely able to lift a bale of hay." At that moment, my memory slammed back into place. I remember the owner of the house having a teenage son and that my brother used to hang out with him. Those brown eyes, the strange lighter tint to them used to fascinate me as a kid, and they were a dead giveaway for this guy's. We exchanged pleasantries for about a minute before I asked him how he ended up like this. As it turns out, his father and grandmother were the ones who created the mirror and the jewelry that activated it. His father had found the cave and begun to pass through to perform quests and such. In return, he would bring back gold and jewelries to support the family. It was profitable before he started to build a reputation. The civilizations on this side of the mirror were about mid-Iron Age, at least when his father started, and had not yet figured out firearms. Because of that, the humans were pretty much mid-level as far as the food chain was concerned. His father decided to bring his flintlock musket to face off larger targets. That's where they got the design for their current level of firearms. After a few years, he had set up a base camp over the cave, and it wasn't long before he'd taken out the biggest monsters controlling the area. He said his father had pictures and showed him once. It was some sort of wyvern with a wingspan of about 30 feet. Though it mainly ate fish, it was still fiercely territorial. Every attempt to kill it or force it out by the locals had resulted in massive casualties. His father was able to take it down with just a few placed shots. It was at this time that I asked him where his father was, and he responded, "With my mother, sisters, and brother." I was confused as he continued. As it turns out, his father wanted to share the bounty with his family, so they packed everything up, only planning to go for about a year. Something happened after a few days. His father came back from the cave scared and out of breath. He never did tell anybody what happened, but he said they had to run. "We didn't get very far," he said, lowering his voice. "They must have seen the fire because they came at us in the night. We were dragged in front of their king, and he screamed at my father. My father stood firm and yelled back until the guards started drawing their weapons. Even as young as I was, I knew they were going to kill us. That is when my father said something that made the room relax." I had to take a breath at this revelation as he continued. "Since then, we have been forced to create things for this king." He must have had a question mark on your face because he continued. "Things like weapons, armor, sawmills, agricultural techniques, and even clothes." This was explaining so much, I thought. I asked, "So why don't you just come back with us now? They got what they wanted." He laughed and responded with, "You really think they would just let us go? Our knowledge of the other side is far more valuable than anything in this kingdom. Hell, when they found out that this was where they had entered from, they built a castle right on top of this place. Just like our old house, it is on the side of a mountain overlooking a field." He paused as though to adjust his thoughts. "Our knowledge has allowed this kingdom to expand faster than the Romans could have even hoped for. So much so that the remainder of the nations are rallying together to overwhelm the army with just sheer numbers." My blood ran cold with this news. "So then why did you start taking the elf prisoners? Don't tell me that the slave trade here is as bad as you think." He lowered his head a bit and said, Oh, I'm sure it's worse. However, these elves were not taken for sale. I just looked at him and said, "What?" He then continued, "These elves have a healing ability. Perhaps you've even seen it." I nodded slightly as he continued. "Something like that would be necessary for a long war. They could just take us down with simple attrition, but if we can refill our men..." With that, my blood went from ice to fire. I said, "I take it diplomacy didn't work." Laughing, he said, "Diplomacy? With creatures of this world?" I could feel my hands tighten around my rifle as he continued. "Do you really think elves would come to the aid of humans? Even the lizards folk that can speak don't want anything to do with the other races." And I suddenly remembered the back of the cave. "So that is why lizard men bodies are down here?" Without hesitation, he responded, "Probably. Though they may be capable warriors, their tactics really suck, and they have no magic to speak of. So for the king, they would be more of a hindrance than an ally." At this point, I looked at the elves, still huddled under their blankets. They looked up at me with fear, concern, and wonder in their eyes. Something I had seen before in my time, in my life, I wanted to forget. They didn't know what we were saying, but maybe they thought I was bartering for their release. I looked back up at the man. He had a strange smile on his face. I know that smile. That is the smile of a politician. That is the smile of someone who thinks they are getting over on you because they are in a certain position. He spoke again. "I figure from the cold air you've broken through the wall. I wouldn't try it. By now they've sent sentries to spear anyone trying to escape. Besides, elves can't swim for shit. They prefer the forest, you know." This made me pause as I noticed that smile was getting more pronounced. "You know, you can't just shoot your way out of here. You may not have bullets like you, but there are far too many corners for you to take where you wouldn't make it through." He paused. "There is another option," looking him in the eyes. "You could join us." "What?" I asked him. "You could join us. Use that modern knowledge to help them improve, and they will pay very well. I'm sure the armor itself would be a national treasure. It took a direct hit, didn't it?" I shuffled a little, remembering the pain, as he continued. "The king would pay handsomely for anything you bring through that gate." I jumped in. "You mean to get access to the gate? So what? He would kill me and try to bring back as many modern tech as possible?" This seemed to actually make him pause. "It doesn't work that way," he replied. "That jewel can carry ties you to the gate. If you were to die, then the gate would shut permanently." He pulled the trinket from his pocket. "As you can see, I carry one as well, but I can never get it to work." Sure enough, it looked like the exact same jewel I had in my pocket. "If you help us, you could live a life in comfort, wealth, and women. You could even make those elves your slaves if you wanted." I looked back at the elves again. In a few moments, I turned back to the man, and he had a very mischievous look on his face. "Give me some time to think about it." He smiled and said, "Of course," and then walked away. Turning back, the elves were whispering to each other while still looking at me. I grabbed a piece of wood on the way by and put it on the fire. Continuing to walk back to the mirror, I passed my friend and my brothers. My friend asked, "So, what are we going to do?" I stopped briefly, deep in thought, and said, "I need to make a call." With that, I went back into the mirror. What would happen next could decide the fate of two separate worlds.